So, hello and welcome to the sixth in the series, Considerations and Strategies for Running Clinical Trials During the COVID-19 Pandemic. My name is Shani Dyer and I'm the CEO of ARCS Australia. So welcome. Can't believe that we're so far into this pandemic and lockdown, even though there are some lifting of some of the lockdown provisions, but still I think we've got a long way to go. So today's webinar, we'll hear from Hanora Jurkovic, from Miriam Cora, from Jackie Everett and Shona Childs. So Hanora is the Clinical Trials Program Manager, Oncology and HMRC Clinical Trials Centre. Miriam is the head of the Academic Project Operations Australian and manager of the Global Internal Training at the George Institute. Jackie Everett is the Director of National Trials at the Australian Parkinson's Mission and the APM Program Manager for the University of Sydney. And Dr. Shona Childs is the Clinical Research Manager at Concord Repatriation General Hospital. So our panel today will give their perspective on the ramifications of the pandemic in relation to academic clinical trials. So the speakers will talk about the ways that they're dealing with clinical trials during the pandemic. But one point I'd just like to say before we go into the program proper is that irrespective that we have a pandemic on, Australia is doing really quite well compared to the rest of the world. And as per the position statements put out by a number of states and the Clinical Trial Project Reference Group, which represents the federal health and the state departments of health, the key message that we need to get out there is that Australia is open for business and that we need to maintain operations where it's safe for the patient, it's safe for the clinical staff, and the data integrity is maintained. So if we put those lenses across what we do and the opportunity to keep those trials in some ways operating, then I think we should. So going on to the next slide, we're very pleased that both MTP Connect and New South Wales Health have come aboard to really help us bring these webinar series to you. It's really important to have such significant stakeholders help us keep the communication channels open, which is really what these seminars are about. Next slide, please, Joe. As a number of you will know, we've initiated a volunteer program that has been going incredibly well and providing people to help out at sites where they've otherwise been short-staffed. And so we'll be hearing about one of those programs in the next couple of weeks, and I'm really looking forward to hearing about that. On the next slide, again, just for housekeeping, we ask that you don't record this session. It will be recorded, and as you know, our sessions will go on to our website, so everybody will be able to listen if they haven't otherwise been able to get on today live. So there you'll see just some of the things. If you want to ask a question, which we'll do at the end, please do so. On the next slide, we do just recognise that whilst we're providing information here, the most up-to-date information can be sourced from health.gov.au, and we'd recommend that you do that. Next slide, Joe, just talks about the series. Just hard to believe that we're so far through now. We have 10 planned. Depending on how the pandemic goes, we may or may not continue those, but we'll see what happens. We're really quite flexible. On the next slide, ARCS, most of you I'm sure know about us now, but we've been around for some 35 years, and our role is representing professionals working in the sector not so much the companies, but the people who are at the coalface. And we're fulfilling, I think, a very valuable service in providing information about this pandemic. On the next slide, Joe, we've got a program called Share, Learn, Connect. This is just to help you understand how you can best work. It sometimes can be a bit tricky working from home, being isolated, not sure what everybody else is doing. And so these programs just help you to understand, you know, how you can stay productive, how you can be connected, and how you stay healthy. So I think I really recommend this to people. You might think you're okay, but sometimes, you know, even I felt at times, you know, a little bit anxious about being at home and, you know, how the business is going and am I doing the right thing? So it affects everybody. So I really recommend you have a look at those. So let's go on to our panelists for today on the next slide, Joe. So I'm really looking forward to hearing the perspective of all of the speakers. Our first speaker is Hanora Yukovic from the NHMRC Clinical Trials Centre, and she'll be giving her perspective on how they're responding to COVID-19. Thank you, Hanora.
Yeah, thanks very much. And I'd just like to start by thanking you for the opportunity to speak and to say well done to ARCS and others on pulling together to create such an informative and timely sharing of knowledge during this unprecedented time. Next slide, please. So for those of you who aren't familiar with the CTC, I thought I'd just give a quick introduction to who we are. We're an academic research centre that has been operating for over 30 years within the Faculty of Medicine and Health at the University of Sydney. We have over 200 staff, 25% of those being academic and 75% professional. And we focus on trials in neonatal, cardiometabolic and oncology. And at any one time, we have approximately 100 multi-centre, local and international trials ongoing. We also host the ANZ Clinical Trials Registry and have departments in biostatistics, informatics, health economics and systematic reviews who run parallel programs of research. Just to put into perspective, we act as sponsor under the umbrella of USID for the majority of our studies, and this includes acting as the local sponsor for many of our global clinical trials that we participate in. So our current experience of COVID has been that the therapeutic areas we focus on remain critical in ongoing access to treatment options for quite vulnerable patient populations. We have had to temporarily suspend a handful of our studies, and we've noted that recruitment has slowed in others, as well as a handful that we are watching and may consider closing early. But for the vast majority, they're continuing with a few modifications, and the workload of our operational teams remains extremely high. Next slide, please. So in preparing for our actions to COVID-19, for each trial, we kept the following points as our key focus: safety of patients, staff and the wider community, the impact of changes on the research itself, and then business continuity. Next slide, please. So our focus for the initial response was managed through a lot of the committees that we have, and it was developing quickly and changing rapidly, as we all know, and we had a large number of active trials that were requesting information and upfront guidance that had to be produced before the regulatory authorities or HRECs had provided their formal guidance documents. And additionally, we noticed that the situation was further ahead for many of our global sites, so we had to act fast to ensure that all changes could be documented and managed appropriately. So our first response was to develop a COVID response team, and that was to facilitate work from home arrangements. They were meeting daily to triage issues and successfully relocated 95% of our staff within 2 weeks. The committee is now focused on ongoing mental health and support, developing guidance for potentially long-term work from home arrangements, and also assisting with remote onboarding of new staff, as we do have some staff continuing to join the CTC. We also decided to change the focus of some of our other regular committees. So our function and project leads committee worked together to develop a trial level guidance template for review and approval by individual trial management committees. And this utilised the draft FDA, MHRA and the CTPRG and New South Wales Health Guidance documents as the templates. We also worked on focusing and developing a COVID-specific risk assessment template to aid in decision making and mitigation strategies across our trials. A COVID exec team has split out of this and they meet on a daily basis and respond to site and HREC questions relating to specific protocols, as well as to provide updated training and support to the trial operations team. Our CTC executive triages issues raised through the operations program relating to CTPRG, the University of Sydney and New South Wales Health Guidance and other guidances locally and globally. They're also asked to input into guidance documents across the industry and are exploring opportunities for COVID-19 research proposals and potential new collaborations. Separately, we engaged with legal, contracts and government funding bodies, as well as our insurance brokers, for considerations on our approach and to ensure ongoing compliance. And our Research Operations Committee have focused on changes to the grant funding rounds and potential impacts on budgets and new trial concepts for the coming months. Key leaders within the CTC have been invited to participate in the development and feedback of New South Wales Health COVID guidance, as well as by the University of Sydney's Clinical Trials Support Office to comment on and add to the university's guidance. And this is ensuring consistency of approach across all the other research centres within the university. Next slide, please. So now I'll go into more of the operational components of what we implemented. So as I mentioned, we completed risk assessments, and this was using a modified Transcelerate template across all of our studies. We tailored the questions within the template to quickly identify COVID-related risks and have compiled the key decisions into an overall study level tracker, which is being reviewed by the Head of Quality and Compliance and Director of Trial Operations. And where we saw status changes of trial halted, recruitment suspended or treatment suspended, we've performed expedited reporting to the university, to our collaborators, to regulatory authorities if applicable, to ethics committees and sites. Following the risk assessments, each project team focused on the development of a per protocol guidance document, which I'll speak about shortly. We are reviewing the need for protocol amendments or changes to PICs or consent forms. However, at this stage, our plan is that if the changes are temporary, that we would incorporate our protocol guidance document as an appendix to the protocol, and that will reinstate our currently approved PICs and protocols once the pandemic resolves. If trial management committees determine that the changes within the protocol, they'd like them to become permanent, then we will look at implementing amendments more quickly. Our focus is remaining on limiting the resource burden at sites so that they can focus on maintaining their patient safety. Next slide, please. From a site's perspective, we've created ongoing and specific communications with sites, and we've designed these and sent them out centrally so that we could prevent the bombardment of communications that sites reported in one of the earlier ARCS sessions. So we've maintained only a few key communications that have been consistent across all our studies. In particular, we've focused on ensuring all sites can easily follow their local provisions, and our guidance focuses on ensuring patient safety is the first priority, followed by other trial considerations. We have requested that all site level process changes and updated SOPs are sent in by sites, and we track these centrally. We've highlighted key points from each of them so that we can have a consolidated picture of changes across all trials at any given site. And we continue to have these reviewed and updated as the information keeps on changing. Our protocol guidance ensures that at no point do we contradict a site level policy. We made the decision to halt on-site monitoring visits for an initial period of 3 months, and this was to ensure ongoing safety of our own team, but also to limit the potential exposure for vulnerable patients. Just to put it into perspective, the oncology team of CTC are based at the Chris O'Brien Lifehouse, which is a specialist cancer centre. And at the time we made this decision, we were being routinely screened for temperature checks to enter the office, so it was clear that it was a reasonable step. Academic studies by nature do not have as intensive a monitoring program as industry, and our standard on-site visit schedule is often only 2 visits per site, unless we identify risks or major issues. So we're quite familiar and comfortable with intensive data checking and remote monitoring. We have been exploring additional review of key data fields through source review remotely and working with sites on their ability to provide this access. But in general, we're focusing more on triaging issues and ensuring appropriate documentation of trial modifications for the patients. Our protocol guidance documents include suggested CRF documentation for modifications, and these documents helped our trial management committees to assess various risks within each study and what types of adjustments could be implemented to ensure the safety of patients, but also maintain the reliability and validity of the trial for analysis. And it aims to guide the sites on how to consistently report what has been modified. All modifications that will be expected for an individual patient are to be clearly described to that patient by an investigator and documented in the medical records, and this is in line with the CTPRG guidance. It also ensures that where modifications are differing between patients, that this conversation can be tailored for each patient and the risk benefit for each individual can be assessed. We're noticing that, on one protocol at a site, treatment visits for infusions may continue per protocol for one patient, whereas another patient in follow-up has switched to telehealth. So our experience at the minute is that no modification notified to us by sites has been consistent across all of their studies, nor all of the visits for a protocol, nor all of their patients. So our aim is that sites are able to tell us what they've had to do and document that, and then we can centrally collate and analyse the study data with the modifications identified. Next slide, please. As we all know, one of the obvious impacts has been the increased number of deviations. So we did develop a COVID-specific protocol deviation log for sites to identify all the changes that had to be made, such as changes to telehealth, study drug needing to be shipped directly to patients, or missed visits. We completed a separate version in-house, which we've tailored a specific code list to help categorise all deviations and issues, and this will allow consistency in reporting. All deviations are being reviewed by project managers, which are then escalated to our clinical leads or study chairs, and quality and compliance as appropriate. And these trigger expedited reporting and/or CAPAs for any serious breaches. And we're expecting that the logs will form the basis for our post-COVID report to ethics and other groups as necessary. Next slide, please. So what are our next steps? We are continuing to review all deviations and SAEs within a study and across studies, as well as updates to the changes at sites. We will assess with each trial management committee whether risks are changing and implement mitigation strategies as necessary, such as the permanent implementation of telehealth, or we may choose to cease recruitment on specific trials. We're actually also looking to analyse the impact of the decisions that were made and how we can potentially better design trials in future that may go down a more decentralised model, such as what's described by Professor Mustafa Kazarov, who was a previous clinical lead at the CTC and is a key author in this idea in the article that I've put as a link here, Adapting to a Pandemic, Conducting Oncology Trials During the SARS-CoV-2 Pandemic. In terms of business continuity, we've now switched focus. We're reviewing staff allocations regularly to support those with increased study activity or who are feeling the impacts of working from home or childminding responsibilities. The university has a recruitment freeze, so we need to be clever in managing with our current workforce. We're also considering reallocation of staff for studies that are on hold or delayed or not going ahead, and this may include retraining staff to support other functions or areas where the work has increased. We are reviewing budgets to reduce costs now in case our timelines blow out, or if there are unexpected costs such as increased study drug management or shipping of samples, and looking at the impacts of potentially delayed milestone payments being achieved or ongoing grant funding being impacted. And as we're starting to see now, sites are beginning to notify us of the planned relaxation of restrictions and reopening of recruitment to studies, so making sure that we're ready to support that and adapt our guidances again. Next slide, please. COVID-19 studies are being planned as part of the New South Wales COVID-19 Research Infrastructure Consortium, which aims to rapidly deploy research and operational support for COVID-19. Our level of involvement is being negotiated, but it may also require another agile response to our staffing to support that activity. We're currently looking to be involved in 3 trials ranging from Bayesian adaptive trials of various treatments in older patients and collaborating with international groups for prospective meta-analyses. I think it's safe to say COVID has actually catapulted many decisions and problems that we previously put in the too hard basket. We've all had to become flexible in updating our processes, training and supporting our staff and researchers. But I think looking at what we've managed to achieve in the past 2 months is really commendable and something that I think we all need to remember and acknowledge and take advantage of, even though at times it may feel too hard. Thank you, and I'll pass on to the next speaker.
Great, thanks very much, Hanora. That was very concise and very informative. And yes, I agree with you on a lot of your points there. So our next speaker is Dr. Miriam Cora from the George Institute, and she'll give an update for us. Just a reminder too that the questions, any questions you have, put those in the chat function and we'll address all of those to the panel at the end of the session. Thanks, Miriam.
Thank you, Shani, and thank you, Hanora. And I'd like to also echo Hanora's comment and thanking ARCS and the sponsors for facilitating these sessions. They've been quite useful, and a lot of our team have been accessing it, and we've been looking at those as well, so thank you. So my name is Miriam Cora, and I'm the head of academic project operation at the George Institute for Global Health. So I thought I'd just give you a bit of a background for those of you that don't know what does the George do. So the George Institute is a global independent medical research institute. Our headquarters is in Sydney, and we have offices in China, India, and UK. So you could imagine the impact of COVID-19 on the type of projects that we do. We have just over 700 staff across the institute globally. Next slide, please. So where does academic project operation fit within the George Institute? We're part of the core unit, which was compiled almost 12 months ago. And next slide, please. And the core unit consists of pretty much 3 hubs or platforms that run across all of the studies. So we have our research and strategy services, our data management, and our stat team. And of course, we have the project operation team, which looks after the life cycle of projects, mainly managing and monitoring and risk management as well. So within Australia, we have just over 60 people within our project operation team. And traditionally, over 18 years ago, all of our programs and divisions have been working in silo. So as of 2 years ago, what had happened, we brought all of the project operation in one platform, and the main reason for that was to see how we could utilize our cross-functional resources. I just wanted to mention this because in a few slides, I think this has been quite beneficial and helped us during this pandemic as well. And also, one of the aim of the platform was building capacity across different programs. So if you need to utilize our resources from a training perspective, it was a bit simpler. Next slide, please. We have a very diverse program across the George Institute, and those are just a couple of our main programs, ranging from cardiovascular, critical care, neurology, mental health, and respiratory. And of course, there's others looking at health system, primary care, and health economic as well. And the type of projects that we do, it's quite diverse as well. They mainly range from phase 2 to phase 4 studies, and the complexity is also diverse as well, ranging from randomized clinical trial with lots of many sites, international sites and locally, to cluster trials, observation, and platform trials. So there's a number of different designs that we're responsible for. Next slide, please. So in terms of the impact of COVID-19 on the type of our projects, I just wanted to start that almost all of our guidance are dependent on the information that are available, obviously locally based on the Department of Health and the clinical trial project reference group, and obviously different jurisdictions. But the George Institute approach was a systematic review of risk and impact, knowing that our project complexity is quite different. The type of project that we do is diverse. So we had to look at our risk plan, and one of the main views was looking at a project review across all of the program, looking at the status, recruitment timelines, resource, and funding. Knowing that from the resource perspective, our personnel and direct research costs could be impacted. In terms of funding, we are academic research organizations, and there are a lot of limitations in terms of project fund and how that could be used for other projects. Sometimes there's limitation and that's not possible. And that could be quite challenging for the projects that are smaller and have a short-term timeline as well. In parallel to that, we also ask all of our project managers and project leads to put together a project contingency plan or a risk mitigation plan. We wanted to know what are the proposed variations, looking at short-term and long-term goals. If there is any delays, obviously monitoring and routine processes, and this was one of the points that was highly impacted, and looking at timelines if there is any delays in recruitments, and how would they be impacted short-term and long-term as well. In terms of the proposed variation, obviously the review based on the project plans and monitoring plans and drug and logistic plans. So there was a number of different variations to look into. So these were our first 2 steps. So we were reviewing the projects, what the project managers and project lead were coming up with different plans, and we put the information together and see what's the best way of going forward. Next slide, please. Within our Australia team, we have 69 active projects at the moment, and this is just over 50% of our projects globally. And roughly between 3 to 5%, we could see that there was a bit of a higher risk, they're categorized. The rest sit between low to medium risk. And our daily activities, there was a change in activities between 15 to 30%. So it wasn't reduced activity, it was quite actually increased activities, and quite challenging looking at across. But what was beneficial for us was this cross-functional resource use. We were able to reshuffle our resources, tap on the shoulders of people that their projects were on hold to assist with others, and that was quite beneficial for us. And we were quite fortunate that we've got a quite expertise across our programs. As overall, our recruitments were pretty much on hold for all the new projects. Our patient recruitments are reduced substantially, but I think when we will see the change in the next 2 to 6 months, you will see the real effect on this. And these are really based on site and study specific. Some projects they still continue on with the project recruitment depending on the site restrictions, and others have been imposed. All of our on-site monitorings were paused and suspended, but most of the on-site monitoring have been amended to remote monitoring. So the increase, we're quite mindful of the activities that are happening at a site level as well. So the activities have increased in terms of remote monitoring, but it hasn't increased as an overall, if that makes sense. there's a lot of communication to the sites, but the number of data points and the review that we do is pretty much very similar. Closeout visits were changed, and most of them are accommodating to look at virtual options. And it was posed, that was part of the contingency plans, to see how we could reduce the backlog once we go through our recovery pause as well. One of the main important part that's been part of the discussion was reviewing a study design and see if we could implement or change any of the project models so we could reduce the backlog of when we go back to the new norm, really. So looking at sample size, if the study is finishing, is it okay to look at the samples and is it okay to close now, or should we wait? Looking at safety data, looking at introducing telehealth, so some of the study design had changed because of that. And looking at system capabilities and background and see, is it possible to recreate different reports and model in terms of the data that's available. Next slide, please. In terms of site and local HREC, so as her mentioned, we did review to see what were the priorities that we need to go back in terms of providing updates or amendments. So looking at consents and study designs. If it's a substantial design in the study, they will prioritize. But if it's something that as an immediate change for during this period, you're not really changing the overall design of the study, they've been noted, and based on the guideline of different jurisdictions, we will have a different reporting to the HRECs. Our focus was to have a clear communication with the site, knowing that obviously there is a massive resource challenges from a site perspective, and from the personnel level, from the timeline level, whether there is a backup within the site. There have been scenarios that the study coordinators have been deployed, and was it possible, even though that you could collect data, was it possible, or did they have the enough resources to do that? And the question was, if there wasn't, if you could put the study on hold, what are the limitations and what could we do next? Is there a principal investigator available? Is there a backup person available in there? In terms of logistic and drug and manufacturing, obviously there were a couple of scenarios, as everybody else have mentioned, looking at different models, whether the drug could be shipped to the patient, or local deliveries from different site to site. Not ideal all the time, but it has been beneficial that has been possible. Drug manufacturing, I think we will see the change in the next 3 to 4 months. Some of the raw material, there is delay in the production. So when it comes to manufacture, most of our studies are okay, but there will be delay towards the end of the year or the 2021 manufacturing batch. So there's delay in those, but we won't see that for another couple of months. But we've already started talking about our next step, what are our new norm, and I think Nora, as Nora mentioned, one of our main criteria that we looked at was looking at different project models. So the studies that are new to us, are we able to look at the model and see what have we learned from this and what could we change? There's a lot of positive discussion in terms of e-consent and using technology better, telehealth, how could we use that better? But I'm very optimistic that there's more positive discussion about how we could access EMR records in different jurisdictions. So there's some positive discussions around that, and also reviewing our legacy system. I think as an academic sector, funding is quite important, and looking at how we could use the technology is quite important, and see where we could make investments. So some of the systems, you might have an electronic process, but in the background it's been quite manual, and I think it's during this time that we found out that it does need a bit of a personal move to have a look at it. So utilizing technology a bit better, it's one of our points to look at that, and perhaps I think looking at lessons learned and shedding some of the inefficiencies that are available now, are more of an optimistic view of looking at the next step. I'm going to stop for now. Thank you.
Great, thanks very much, Miriam. That was very clear as well. So our third speaker today is Jackie Everett. Thank you, Jackie.
Hi, everyone. So really do thank the time of ARCS to contact us and request us to be involved in this presentation, as well as the two former speakers who have taken us through different aspects. So I come from the Australian Parkinson's Mission, and for those who don't know what that is, basically it's an innovative 5-year research grant program. It combines clinical trials and biomarker technologies and breakthrough genomics for people living with Parkinson's disease. So the program was going to go ahead and its clinical trial was about to start when COVID actually hit. So our situation was, of course, different to the others as we were greatly impacted by COVID. And so I suppose it was about the collaboration between the different parties involved. As the sponsor of the study is the University of Sydney, I contacted them and requested if they had any standpoint on the COVID. The sites participating in our study undertook the same process. And as well as we have a CRO, and we did the same process with the CRO. What we found at the beginning was that not everyone was prepared for what COVID was going to turn into, and they hadn't really thought about and were running off, just sort of jumping from stage to stage, trying to work out what would happen and the impact. So what I did was I sat down with the Novatech team, which is our CRO, and we worked out a plan of action for our study. That also included some information that had to go to our participants. We have participants registered through the Australian Parkinson's Mission who are all geared up to actually participate in the clinical trial. And at that time, of course, we had to inform them that the study was not going to start. And so what we did was draft an Australian Parkinson's Mission documentation that went out to the patients and is up on our website. That indicated what was happening at the sites and the fact that they were currently closed to recruitment. It also indicated what process would be followed when the sites were actually back up and open. And it gave some feedback or information to the patients to remind them about COVID and what that meant, when they should talk to their doctor and go and get tested. A lot of the Parkinson's patients, as they have comorbidities, would be greatly impacted in the event that they did get COVID. And so that was one of our biggest concerns with our patient population. The second thing after that was provide that guidance to the sponsor, and that sort of resulted in a chain reaction. And so then our sponsor worked with various parts of the university, including, as they indicated, the NHMRC Clinical Trial Centre, to produce a set of documents. One of them was a submission form. We've seen that form replicated throughout the majority of the sites that are participating in the Australian Parkinson's Mission trial. And the submission form makes you go through a risk assessment process for undertaking clinical trials at this time. You have to fill out the form and submit it to undertake the study on site here at the University of Sydney, and we found that, as I said, with the other hospitals as well. They also released 2 sets of documents, which was conducting a GC compliant clinical trial during COVID, and also a guideline for when the university is a sponsor of a clinical trial and not a site for the clinical trial. As the university sponsors many clinical trials done in both health sectors, private practices, and as well as, the public and people's homes. The second part was to ensure that all of our staff that were at our sites had received appropriate training. And so we just set a minimum of the sites. A lot of the sites had processes put in place by their local health authorities. That was for the public hospitals. But for our private sites participating in the Australian Parkinson's Mission trial, they were actually calling for assistance. They came to the sponsor through myself and said, could you please set us a minimum standard that we must meet when participating with the clinical trial? And that, I think, it showed that there are many sites out there that don't have the resources of the local health districts, and so therefore they were struggling during this time. So we set a guideline, which is based on the OHMR guidelines, but it's site-specific. So we processed the guideline and we sent it to all of our sites and asked them for their feedback in regards to, 1, could they meet the requirements listed in the guideline, and 2, if they were able to, if there was any problems with that. So the guideline was not very hard, and you would have seen it in all of the local health districts. It's taking the temperature with when the person arrives at the reception. It's doing a pre-call before they visit to make sure they don't have any flu-like symptoms. It's what to do with them in the event that they do present at the clinic and they have a temperature. So do you have an isolation room? What equipment is located in that isolation room? What staffing is actually moving in and out of that room? Ensuring that each room was cleaned before and after each of the scheduled visits. PPE equipment. Many of the sites had enough PPE equipment for a short period of time, but they were unable to get more PPE equipment due to the fact that there was lack of stock. And so a number of sites had indicated there was a concern there with having the required PPE. One of the other things that we did with the CRO is have COVID-specific meetings. So I have 2 calls per week. One of them is about the study and the other one is about COVID. We wrote the COVID contingency plan, which was study specific. We updated the protocol to ensure that we were collecting COVID status at each and every visit, and the interaction that may have with our study. As they're trying various treatments for COVID upon a person being diagnosed positive, and not all patients are receiving that treatment, it was important for us to ensure that we collected the data, because in our study we have 3 investigational products, and we don't know the interaction of those investigational products with the various products which could be prescribed by a GP or in a hospital environment for a patient suffering from COVID-like symptoms. And so therefore we needed to update the protocol to collect that information. We also had to update the patient information sheets for that, and also our electronic ECRF had to be updated as well. And we had to give instruction to each and all of our sites in regards to how that would happen and when that would happen and what they would do with that information when collected. Of course, that meant that we needed to pay the sites more because we were asking them to undertake a process that was above and beyond what the original protocol was. So that meant we had to go through the process and work out the budget implications of that. For the majority of the sites, because they were undertaking that anyway, they have indicated that they don't want any further budget funds for asking the COVID questions, as it is now a site requirement. When working with the sites, what we found with them was that across Australia, with state health authorities undertaking different processes, the impact on the site was different. And so therefore the impact on the study is different. It was hard for some of the sites to actually work with their governance and ethics, and that some governance and ethics officers were greatly impacted by having closed and did not have the facilities to work online at home. And so therefore, some ethics and some governance officers have been impacted and are at reduced rates. Staffing, there was many staff at the public health units where the nurses have been identified and they have been retrained. In the event that they were called to be required to change location, they would be. And so therefore that information had to come back to myself and our CRO in regards to how we were going to manage if nurses and doctors at the site, but mainly in this situation, it was actually nurses that were going to be taken away from study-specific issues and, of course, put in the COVID teams to work through the pandemic. For patients, our main concern for patients is them attending the clinic, and therefore what would happen in the event that they had to come into the clinic and were exposed. Again, these patients have a number of comorbidities, but due to that, they are at a high risk. So it was about preparing patient information that was specific to them and having the doctors have that information so they could talk through the patients. In our clinical trials, because we are dealing with Parkinson's disease, we cannot do telehealth. We can do telehealth for clinical visits, but we cannot do them for the clinical trial visits. when they're trying to take gait measurements of a person, which requires them to walk on a gait map. You are unable to do that, of course, in a person's home or in another location in a hospital. It needs to have all be set up and validated. So we have to consider in our situation, we have to work out how we're going to move forward and have patients be brought into the various clinics. And so that meant talking to each of the individual clinic managers and working with them about how big their clinical rooms are, how many people actually can sit inside the clinic room but be still social distancing with the 1.5 metre apart. How many people are normally in their waiting room, removing chairs from the waiting room, limiting the number of people that are actually allowed to come to the visits. And of course, temperature checking and utilising sanitizer gel between and as soon as they arrive in the building, and then also when they leave and before they go home. So a number of the sites that are preparing to actually activate at this present time. And so we have been going through with them the contingency plans and working out how they will actually function at a site while still meeting the requirements of the social distancing and all COVID related requirements. From the APN's perspective, our main concern is always our patients, and therefore after that our staff and at our sites. And so we took the consideration of to stop recruitment at this time, to give each of our sites and the staff at those sites the ability to work out and work through the COVID pandemic, and then work with them closely to try and start the study most probably in June, when we can give appropriate messaging to the patients to say the sites are open and they are safe, and the safety of the patients can be assured while visiting and transferring through to the site. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you so much, Jackie. Again, very informative. Our final speaker is Dr. Shona Childs. Shona is the Clinical Research Manager at Concord Repatriation General Hospital. Shona.
Thank you very much. Just to give you a brief introduction about Concord Haematology Research Unit. Currently we have about 28 trials that are recruiting, with about another 40 in long or short-term follow-up. And our portfolio of trials is roughly about half commercially sponsored, and then the other half is investigator-led trials. So in terms of how we've approached this COVID pandemic, as others have said, the health of our patients, staff and any visitors has been the main factor in any decisions that we've been made, especially as our patient population are immunosuppressed. So the first port of call for me was to develop a COVID response plan, as others have done as well, and just to address how we deal with our patients, how we interact with other departments within the hospital, how we work with a limited supply of PPE, and even down to how we deal with our paper records, as paper had been identified as a potential transmission risk. So the COVID response plan also dealt with how we interacted with external people on site, and that's just not monitors either. We had to think about how we were dealing with the couriers coming to collect samples, and just all the interactions with different people, because there's so many moving parts in a hospital and different departments interacting with each other. We also had to think about contingency plans regarding staff redeployment, or even the quarantine of our staff, as working from home was not really an option for us. So we had to think about how we could best social distance from each other to make sure that we wouldn't all be off as a direct contact if someone came down with COVID. How we interacted with our RGO and the HREX as well about any changes. We basically took the approach that any changes we were making were urgent safety measures, and we would document them as appropriate, but if we needed to, we can report retrospectively. We had to approach this on a case-by-case basis for each patient, and the needs of that patient have to be weighed against the risk of COVID-19. So for example, if we are operating telehealth and a patient needs a physical exam, then is it symptom directed? Is the physical exam only mandated by the protocol? Do we really need to do it? Is it more of a risk to have them come into the hospital when they're immunosuppressed to have that if they're otherwise well? So we had to do that for every patient basically, and weigh it against each trial. So it's been a huge undertaking for us as a site. So far, out of our trials, we've only had 5 trials put on hold with recruitment due to COVID, and only one of those was investigator-led. And it's also interesting to note that 3 of the other trials were phase 1 trials, which are obviously very different in terms of risk factors. So this particular collaborative trial that we had put on hold was led from the UK. The international sponsor was the University of Liverpool, with our local sponsor, the ALLG. And while in Australia right now we could potentially still recruit to that, locally we acknowledge that in the UK they're facing their own unique situation, and they've got their own issues to deal with. So in terms of recruitment, we have not, as a site, we have not halted any recruitment, because in most cases, it's more of a risk to stop the treatment to the patient if that's the treatment that they need, than it is to reduce their potential exposure to COVID by coming in for treatment. So given our portfolio is sort of split between commercially sponsored and investigator-led trials, the experiences we're facing, it's basically the same across both. And in fact, for investigator-led, it's actually easier in some ways, as others mentioned. Monitoring. We did limit monitoring for a while. We actually completely halted on-site monitoring for 3 weeks. But then we looked at the situation, and given the curve was flattening, we opened our site again for on-site monitoring. Obviously, where each CRA is screened, temperature screened, with questions that everyone is using for screening, and we're limiting the number on site. But we just wanted to remain as open as business as possible, just by weighing the risks and just adapting as quickly as we can to the changing face of COVID. We moved to telehealth consults as well, and we've also implemented couriers to deliver IP where we can, because we have patients coming in from not just in the city area, patients in more rural locations in New South Wales who don't want to travel all the way into Sydney just to collect their medication. And obviously maintaining their treatment is of the utmost importance. So we've really just attempted to operate as business as usual as much as possible, balancing the risk to our staff, to the patients, to any visitors to the site. And it's been challenging taking all of those looking at it from every different aspect. So in general, yes, we have seen recruitment drop, but we haven't seen patients unwilling to come onto site. They're still willing to come onto site when it's required of them, if they need to do a blood test, if they need that physical exam because they have symptoms. In some cases, just stopping recruitment and closing is more of a risk, so we have to just weigh that up for each patient. We've not had any impact on our funding as yet. In terms of RGO, we have seen increased wait times, but that's across the board. And I can only speak for locally. For Concord, our RGO office have been incredibly supportive and helping us through with any questions that we might have. But they've obviously got increased workload, and that does slow our wait times, does increase our wait times rather. But we've been pushing forward with governance for all our trials, even if we cannot open them right away, because we want to be in the position to open those trials when it's safe to do so. But I think for investigator-led trials, they're more likely to be approved in some cases because they are mostly standard of care. We do have some other trials that are phase 1. Obviously, that is a different, if it's first in human and it's more intensive, that's a completely different issue. So for investigator-led trials, it's actually an advantage for RGO, I think, because they would look at it as in it's not much above and beyond what they would already be going through anyway. And as others have mentioned, the monitoring hasn't really been impacted for us because of there's much reduced monitoring frequency on investigator-led trials, and so that's not really been an impact for us, which is good because remote monitoring is hugely challenging because we cannot give external users remote access at all, and scanning and redacting is ethically dubious, and just because not only does it cause an increased risk of privacy breach, but it's just a huge amount of work as well for the site staff, which we don't really have time to do. Yeah, so I think from a site's perspective, just sorry I rushed through that bit, it's just trying to keep it as brief as possible so there's time for any questions, but I think that was about it from our perspective. Yeah. And I'll hand back if there's any questions. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Shona. Yeah, terrific, and I must say, like to say thanks to all of our speakers. It's so great to hear from such experienced and knowledgeable people and how they're dealing with this very, very unique situation. But it's so inspiring to hear everybody. Before we go to questions, I would also like to thank our sponsors again, MTP Connect and New South Wales Health, who make these series possible for us. So I will hand over to Sue Mason, who will triage the questions. Now, I know we don't have very much time and I know we have to finish on time. If we don't get through all the questions, we will post those on our website and look to get those addressed as well. So I'll hand over to Sue Mason. Thank you, Sue.
Okay, thanks for that, Shani. Nora, there's a question for you. Have you seen any new trends in deviations that may be useful for other sites or academic organisations to look out for?
I think bulk of the deviations that we're seeing are requests to have telehealth or potentially patients being seen by other you know, like a GP to follow up on their, you know, to track their follow-up visits. We've had some requests for study drug to be shipped to site to the patients directly, and I think for some of our trials it's able to be managed. But for a lot of our studies, you know, they're coming in for infusions, and that's not possible. But yeah, I think the biggest change we're seeing is the requests for more flexibility with timelines for visits and where those visits can occur.
Sorry, I just had to unmute myself.
Okay.
One question that before we finish up, because we do have to finish on time and maybe leave it for people to think about, is you know, hearing all the stories from you guys, how do we embed these learnings? I mean, a lot of new things have come in place. How do we embed these into policies that enable them to be continued after we finish the pandemic and we come out the other side and not just revert back to ordinary, you know, the way it was before? For me, that's going to be the really key question, and I know we've just about finished our time. So, look, I'll finish it there. Again, thank you to our sponsors and to our speakers. Next week, it may seem you know, premature, but we're looking at recovery, and it's not premature because the recovery process has got to start before we finish with the pandemic, and I really look forward to next week's session on the 11th of May, considerations for recovery. Thank you very much to everybody for joining us today, and we'll see you next week. Have a great week. Thank you.